Welcome everyone to lecture number 17 on the interwar years and World War II. If you'll recall, in our prior lecture, we talked about the Treaty of Versailles 1919 and the huge war debt that will be leveled on Germany at the end of that conflict. The German economy was not doing well, though, after the war and was having a hard time moving forward economically and technologically, especially given the fact that a tremendous amount of industry had been destroyed during the prior war. And then you throw in the introduction of the Great Depression, a global worldwide economic downswing, and you have a firestorm of bad events that are just going to lead Germany's economy off the rails during this period. You can see the inflation of the German mark, their currency, for example, during the late 19-teens and early 1920s. It's going to get even worse than that over time. We're also going to have a string of rather weak leaders during this period. The Germans are going to experiment with actually creating a republic, a new form of government that they'd never tried before, but it just is not catching on. Worse, people are suffering from high unemployment in Germany during this period. As resentment and desperation in Germany grew, radical political parties began gaining in popularity, each one promising to heal the nation's economic wounds. The most prominent of this new crop of authoritarian leaders was Adolf Hitler, leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or as most people are familiar with, the Nazi Party. This party began growing rapidly over time and getting their politicians elected to the German parliament with increasing success. By 1933, Hitler pressured the German president, Paul von Hindenburg, into appointing him as chancellor, a position from which he was able to quickly consolidate his political power over the entire country. Why did he become so popular? Well, Hitler was able to rise to power legally because he promised to fix everything that was wrong with Germany. He was the man that would get it done, he claimed. He promised to eliminate unemployment, and he will set up a number of massive public works programs that will produce housing, railroad lines. A big part of his plan was to also hire workers to state industries to rebuild the military of Germany. And he had some real success in cutting the number of jobless in Germany. But all this came at a huge political cost. As early as July of 1933, the Nazi Party was declared the only legal political entity in Germany. And by 1938, Germany had turned into a total dictatorship. Why are people going along with the loss of their rights during this period? In a nutshell, Adolf Hitler was interested in restoring German pride, and he appealed to the vanity and pride of the German public by saying that it was time for Germany to take its position as world leader back on the international stage. In order to do that, he wanted to rebuild the military. He's going to begin an ambitious program of taking over territory in Europe, and the German people are delighted with this. He will also unfairly single out certain elements in German society as being the supposed root of all evil. Hitler will tap into an existing deep vein of anti-Semitism in European history that stretches back hundreds and hundreds of years. Jewish populations had been abused, rounded up, killed over the centuries due to some lingering very negative stereotypes. And what Adolf Hitler will do is he's going to incite even more anti-Semitism in Germany. He will inaccurately claim that the Jews were responsible for Germany losing World War I. This is a falsehood, but people said, wow, I've never heard that before. You mean we could have actually won this war? Tell me more, right? They'd rather hear that they could have won the war rather than the reality of that they actually lost the war. What we will see is eventually German troops will be sent into neighborhoods to begin rounding up Jewish civilians. They initially began cordoning off certain sections of the city and forcing Jewish residents to be identifiable by wearing an armband. And as this happens, as they are unfairly singled out and blamed for Germany's problems, the public begins their own attacks on these individuals. A good example of this is the Night of Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht, which took place on November 9th and 10th, 1938. During this event, mob violence broke out across the country as the regular German police stood by and watched. hooligans loot, smash Jewish shops and department stores, set them on fire. Synagogues were targeted for vandalism. Members of the SS and the Hitler Youth organizations beat and murdered Jews, broke into their homes and wrecked them, brutalizing Jewish women and children. And Hitler was quite clear about his ultimate goal, that they must disappear. We must exterminate them. By late 1941, the first Jews from Germany and Western Europe were now being gathered and transported along with many other minorities to concentration camps in places such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, and Ukraine. There were other groups that were unfairly caught up in this dragnet by the SS, the Romani or the Gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals were also unfairly targeted for abuse and were sent off to these camps. Of course, many will never return. They will perish there. For German citizens, hearing rumors of the groups that were disappearing from their midst over time, most folks didn't care, or they just remained willfully ignorant of these developments. To them, Hitler was their man. He was the one that was restoring German pride, not just the economy. He was willing to stand up to the League of Nations and rebuild the German military. He also began to openly speak of the need for living space or living room for German populations. This is in German is known as Lebensraum. So, for example, in March of 1938, offering little in the way of justification, Nazi troops simply invaded Austria and added it to the German Reich. Now, countries such as Britain and France are definitely noticing the rearmament of Germany, their former foe in the Great War. They are rattled, they're disturbed, but at home, their public is still exhausted from World War I. There are people who, within living memory, had gone through that conflict. They had sent their sons, their husbands, their cousins off to war, and they never returned. And they were not about to do the same thing now with a newer generation of youth in their country. Further, both Britain and France had also endured the lean times as a result of the global Great Depression, and they could not afford war, literally or figuratively. And so for Hitler, he's aware of this, okay? He's pushing the bounds. He's deliberately poking, and taking over some of these territories, and he's gauging the reaction of Britain and France. He knows that their public does not want to go to war again, so he is making hay while the sun shines. Well, what we will see is in 1938, the Munich Conference will be held. And Britain and France will send representatives to talk to Nazi Germany, and they will work to appease Adolf Hitler. This policy of appeasement, that's basically giving in, hoping that a bully will simply grow tired of picking on other people and will turn to somebody else. This is their policy of giving in. Again, it's not because they don't understand and that they aren't alarmed by what Hitler is doing, but they feel like their back's against the wall, that they can't afford war, and this is the best that they can do in the hopes of averting a future conflict. It, of course, will not work. Hitler, in fact, is turning his greedy eyes now to the country of Poland. And because Poland lies between Germany and the USSR, or the Soviet Union, he's worried about possibly triggering a war with the Soviet Union if he moves on Poland. So what we will see is in 1939, a meeting between the German foreign minister and the Soviet foreign minister. And they announced that the Soviet Union, as well as Germany, had signed a 10-year non-aggression pact. This meant that for a period of time, both powers would agree not to attack one another, no matter what. Why are these two former combatants now making nicey-nice? It's because the Soviet Union also had its eyes on some territory that it wanted to snatch in Eastern Europe. For example, the private part of this agreement is that they agreed to basically carve up much of Eastern Europe, that Germany would be allowed to take over portions of Poland and other regions that he wanted, and the Soviet Union would be allowed to take over portions of Lithuania, Estonia, half of Poland. In other words, they were secretly, trying to say, okay, with regard to the future of Europe, you get this, I get that. But of course, how much can you trust Adolf Hitler? Very little, it would seem, as the Soviets will find out in just a few years. Now, even though Britain and France had been practicing appeasement towards Nazi Germany's aggression for years, the final line in the sand for both of those countries, like the hard stop, was Poland. Both of them had made it very clear, and Hitler had agreed to leave Poland alone. But again, you can't trust Adolf Hitler. So what he's going to do is, now that he doesn't have to worry about the Soviet Union attacking him on his eastern front because he signed this non-aggression pact with them, now he's suited up. He's ready to go ahead and provoke Britain and France into war. He is confident that he can take them down. So he will go after Poland with their invasion of Poland in September of 1939. Britain and France, even though they've been trying to avoid it, they will finally declare war on Nazi Germany. Germany, of course, will ultimately become allied with several other powers in what becomes known as the Axis powers during the conflict, and Japan will be one of their allies. Why would Imperial Japan agree to ally with Nazi Germany? Well, because they too had become similarly very aggressive militarily during the 1920s and 1930s. They too had experienced a number of economic hardships as a result of the Great Depression, severe famine in certain areas as a result of almost unlimited population growth. We'll see that military and right-wing movements will emerge in Japan, and just like in Germany, you're going to see a military elite that will say, we've got the answers to all of your problems. Japan will also seek to overrun other areas of Asia due to the fact that, as a string of islands, they had long since burned through many natural resources that they needed to continue industrializing and to continue building up their navy and military. They begin looking outwards, therefore, for natural resources such as coal, iron, rubber. But in the instance of China, rather than working out, peaceful trade deals with them, they're going to straight up take over Manchuria and northern China in 1932, and they will continue to exert more and more control as the years pass by. All of this will generate intense misery for the civilian population of China, now coming under the cruel domination of the Japanese Imperial Army, occupying their country. For instance, in December of 1937, the Japanese Imperial Army marched into China's capital city of Nanking and proceeded to slaughter 300,000 out of 600,000 civilians and soldiers in the city. This is often referred to as the Rape of Nanking, and that's meant in a figurative sense, as in the destruction of the city, and it is very much meant in the literal sense as well. For instance, we will see that tens of thousands of Chinese civilian women will be turned into sex slaves to, accommodate the wishes of the Imperial Japanese Army, kept in sexual bondage for a number of years. And by 1940, the Japanese government had announced its intention to establish, quote, a new order in East Asia, unquote. And they began expansion and settled into a formal alliance with both Germany as well as Italy. So we'll turn now to Italy, the third prong of the Axis powers. Italy will also see the rise of a strong man dictator, in their case, that of Benito Mussolini. Mussolini will claim that it was time for Italians to make a play for international territory and to show the world what they were capable of. For instance, in October of 1935, Mussolini, after rebuilding the Italian military, sent the Italian army into Ethiopia in North Africa to take it over. Then in 1939, Italy will invade Albania. It's quite easy to see that for Mussolini as well as Adolf Hitler, that they were two peas in a pod, right? They had a common aggressive nationalism that was driving their repressive states, and so they will form a formal alliance, military alliance with Germany in 1939. We'll pick up with how the war goes in the second part of this video series.